Guardians of the Galaxy. Now, at the time, this felt like a deviation for Marvel. The impression a lot of people had was this was a comedic side quest for their universe that was destined to float out there as a curious little one-off. Instead, it pretty much redefined what a Marvel movie would be going forward, which is really lots and lots and lots of jokes. It was refreshing at the time, though the irrelevance probably ended up being overdone in a few Marvel movies. It was probably intended and planned to be a turning point, as I think this was the first time we got any significant scenes with Thanos, and of course the sisters would end up playing an integral role in Endgame, but none of that was understood when this came out. Well, I hope you like the 80s. This is dripping in vintage nostalgia. I have a theory that the 80s never really existed. If you look at the hairstyles and clothes from the 90s, even the music, and compare it to what they call the 70s, there's a natural evolution there. But all that alien stuff in between, I mean, come on. I think they needed to invent a pre-internet computer age. I mean, think about it. Why would anyone be using a computer if there was no Wi-Fi? What would you even do on it? It makes no sense. Secret government technology got leaked to the public about 25 years ago, and they had to explain its sudden appearance. Thus, we get 10 years inserted that conveniently no one remembers because of apparently drugs from Miami. But I do love that 80s neon look that they managed to insert everywhere in this movie, often in the form of holograms, which are everywhere. And the opening was a real treat in that regard. Reminded me a bit of the virtual mall scene in Valerian. 3D loves transparent stuff, and there's nothing more pleasing than to see transparent layers crisscross paths in stereo. Also of note is the rain in that opening fight. We see not only the usually blurry rain effects layered on top, but they also separate out some running water and droplets that really sells the effect and brings you in. Up in space, we don't get any of that realistic nonsense. We see the spaceships pop out from the stars and the roundness of the planets like a big cosmic billiard table. Perhaps my favorite moment, though, is this crane shot that flows from a nicely defined space station shot into a dirty window on it. Just a perfect use of 3D. Now, inside that same station, which I guess is a jail, it's perhaps the best stereo moments of the movie inside there, with lots of bars and metal and long hallways to look down. It occurred to me that Guardians 1 and Suicide Squad were very similar movies. Maybe James Gunn has a jail fetish. Look at this broken window. Now, there are lots of broken windows in this movie. It, again, is another great use of transparency in stereo. I have heard that most of the time, glass in these big movies, even if it isn't breaking, is usually added in later in CGI, which lets them make a variety of decisions about how clear it's going to be in post. I imagine, then, that they must provide that as a separate compositing layer to the conversion team, which would go a long way in explaining how they managed to do such a great job converting the layered glass here. One thing I noticed with Guardians is we are out in space visiting a lot of exotic locations, and when viewed flat, a lot of these weird space station and cities can look like, well, they can look like a big confusing mulch, especially if they're only on screen for a few seconds. I notice that the 3D helps the brain figure out what exactly it's looking at, and very quickly. I can quickly grasp what's in front and what's behind, what's connected to what is a platform and what is a wall. It helps make sense of the scenery, and for me demonstrates an importance of not making big shots flat in these sci-fi movies. And yes, frame violations. Always a nice find. I used to think that these were a rare 3D trick, and maybe they are, but I think I found about 6 films so far that do this, and it's always fun. The frame ratio bounces around a bit on this one. It goes from filling up every inch to a litter box fairly often. I found for 3D I much prefer the image to take up every available inch on my screen. There seems to be some dynamic with my eyes using the wall behind my TV as a baseline of sorts, and the black bars on the TV compete with that baseline when they're present. I haven't quite put my finger on what's going on, but it's something I've come to notice. Also, as I'm on the subject, some time ago, Tommy Boy from Tommy Boy 3D mentioned he adds a bit of light behind the TV, which he found helps the 3D experience. And I agree. I started using a dim orange light behind my 3D TV set, and my eyes really seem to enjoy that. I'm not sure why. Speaking of background, this movie doesn't really let the stereo go very far behind any characters on screen. Was it an aesthetic choice, the state of, or the costs of 3D technology at the time? Or maybe they weren't sure audiences would accept more disparity. No idea. But this is closer to what we get in the present day, which is 2023. The foreground is wonderfully defined, but we tend to hit a stereo wall behind them very quickly. I actually noticed the 3D felt slightly less, for lack of a better word, I'll say real. Obviously, nothing is real here in a technical sense. It's just the background rarely felt like it faded out naturally relative to the stereo image I was seeing up front. Some shots almost felt like it was encased in a stereo bubble. Some scenes are more generous than others, but most of the enjoyment is going to come from what's out front. Now, what makes this, though, particularly special, and which I might compare to, say, Multiverse of Madness, is that there's always lots and lots to see. There's always something interesting happening. Like, look at these floaty lights. How can you not like 3D floaty lights? It's just a beautiful fishbowl moment. And we also get clusters of spaceships. And spaceships, of course, being blown up with lots of debris. Or really just things exploding with glass-like particles flying out. It's a very visually stimulating movie that does lots with particle effects that's never boring for the eyes. And, well, story-wise, I had not seen this since it played in the theaters back in the 80s, and my memories of it have become a bit warped. I think my initial impressions had gotten a bit lost and mixed up with other Marvel movies, and I was having trouble separating it out from the overall timeline. And in doing so, I forgot how much fun this thing was. This was an absolute blast from top to bottom, and I'm glad I revisited it.